Be live in 5 seconds. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining on time. Today's Democracy Samvaad is very, very exciting. But before we dive into it, I'm going to quickly share what Indian School of Democracy is for those of you who are joining us for the first time. Indian School of Democracy is a non-partisan organization, and we conduct short-term and long-term programs for aspiring grassroots politicians. Our vision is that one day we really have young people who have moral courage and imagination to really get into politics and make democracy work for every single citizen of the country. And as a step towards that, we do these weekly online Facebook Live, which are open to public, where we try to have a slightly different conversation about politics than what we see on TV. And every week we get different speakers. Today's speaker is very special, but what's more special also is that today one of our alumni from She Represents program is going to moderate the session. Before I introduce Lipsa, who's the moderator, I quickly want to put a plug for our program for which we are accepting applications. It's called the Good Politician Program. It's a 9-month program for people who are planning to contest elections at a village or a city level in the next 2 or 3 years. And the program will be both in Hindi and English, and it's a combination of immersion and academics. So please check it out on our website. We'll also put a link in the comments. And with that, I'll introduce Lipsa. So Lipsa is currently in Bhubaneswar, and that's where she's from. She has been an alumni of IIT, IIM, has worked in the private sector before she realized that her calling truly is to serve her state of Odisha. So she left all of that, moved to Odisha, worked in primary education with Akshara Foundation, and now she works with LabourNet. And she's doing some incredible work, and we hope to see her contest elections very, very soon, because all of us know that we need more women in politics. So with that, Lipsa, over to you.
Thank you, Himakshi, for such a generous introduction. And of all the things you described me as, I think my alumnus of ISD is what I love bragging about almost everywhere. And thank you, Rwitwika, for being with us today. I'll just quickly introduce you for our viewers, and then we can start with our conversation. I'm super excited about that. So Rwitwika Bhattacharya is the CEO for the Swaniti initiative, a non-profit that delivers development solutions to government officials in India. As CEO, her role focuses on developing long-term growth strategies and formulating key partnerships with central and state governmental bodies. Prior to Swaniti, but Rwitwika was working at the World Bank as an associate on labor market issues. Her work experience includes working in firms like UNFPA and the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry. She's a master's in public policy from Harvard Kennedy School and a bachelor's in economics and political science from Wake Forest University. She's published 2 books, Frontiers in Development Policy and Labor Market Primer, and has also published a very interesting book, What Makes a Politician. And she's a Forbes India's 30 under 30, a special invited to the White House for her work on social enterprise, and a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Shaper program. We are really grateful to you for being with us today on Sunday and being part of Democracy Samvaad. And we'll just get started with our conversation for the day. When we were recommended to read this book, What Makes a Politician, as part of our IST program, what's very interesting is about the book is that it literally reads like a mentor talking to the reader, like you were truly invested in that reader's dreams of becoming a politician, and the way you have taken out time to just atomize all elements of it, even prepare those reflection tables for self-analysis. So I think the story of why you wrote this book is just as important for us as to understand the core of what makes a politician. If you could just share that why with all of us.
Thanks so much, Lipsa. Thank you for having me here today. I think what the Indian School of Democracy is doing is remarkable in terms of getting young talent into politics. And that's precisely why I wanted to write this book. And Lipsa, I think you, being a woman who's keen to run for office and hopefully will do so very soon, I think that's what's essentially inspiring and driving force a lot of why I wanted to write this book. The issue is that, if you go into consulting, if you go into entrepreneurship, if you go into essentially even medicine, there are so many books which tell you how to do that. You talk to your seniors, you go talk to alumnus of school programs, and essentially you have an idea of how to do that. The reason I wanted to write this book is because I was always interested in government governance, kind of the electoral side of politics. But when you go in to talk to people and you say, well, how did you become a politician? You don't really always get a straight answer.
Mm.
And I think I'm euphemizing when I say you don't always get a straight answer, because it's unlikely that you do. And usually, you hear stories about how people kind of either coincidentally came into politics or were kind of grassroots worker and came into politics, but you don't really get into the nitty gritties of, well, how did you choose a party, how did you decide you wanted to kind of go into this space. And especially when I was writing this book, right before that time, there was like the whole kind of Prashant Kishore movement, there was the whole quote professionalizing of politics. There were a lot of young people who were leaving their full-time jobs to get into what politics is. And yet there was no set path of how do you do that. There was no path at all of like a predefined path of how do you do that. And the point of the book for me was kind of seeing this movement all around me, was actually going and having conversations and saying, well, how did you get in? And then the intent of the book was to take all of that story, all of those stories, and start weeding out kind of the simple pieces. And if I was talking to you, and in my work I kind of have to list down things in bullet points, was what is the bullet point version of how do you get into politics.
Got it. And that's why the book reads like a very essential primer that anyone who wants to get into politics should be picking up. But even someone who is in that journey and wants to just reflect back, it's a very interesting book to just go by and see what I might have just missed, right? And that's such an important piece of literature that you have created for this entire ecosystem.
Absolutely. And I think, Lipsa, for example, for gender, right? So being a woman, like what are the things that you need to be cautious about as well, right? So, of course, we encourage women to get out into politics, but then there's like inevitably like a reputational component to it. So what do you go ahead and prepare, which people will not tell you about? And you kind of have the whole hearsay. So can we actually have examples of that as well? And say, okay, this is what the other person had to go through. Be mentally prepared. You might have to do the same thing.
Got it. Got it. I think, and I think we will spend the rest of the 1 hour in picking up insights from the book and throwing it out for our viewers to kind of understand it even better. My next question is around Swaniti. I think it's one of the earliest vehicles to attract professional talent to support public leaders in driving development. And we are seeing that model being replicated across in various elements across programs and fellowships now. And what's interesting for me is that in the book, you are emphasizing on the importance of a multi-stakeholder nature of politics itself, how the party is important, the party worker is important, the constituents are important, the parliament is important. So in vehicles like Swaniti, do professionals actually get a chance to understand this multi-stakeholder nature and the long-term nature for social change, or are we mostly settling down for problem fixing? How are you seeing this pan out for these kind of programs and fellowship?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, what has been really phenomenal in the last 5 years has been that we have, if I may liberally use the term, opened up the government quite a bit, in the sense that you actually have more structured programs to work with different government bodies. Now, they have been quite a bit of them have been on the bureaucratic side. So you have a lot of chief minister's fellows programs, you have a lot of state government programs. These are important nonetheless, because like you mentioned, being multi-stakeholders, a political leader does not only need to know about how his or her party works or how his or her cadre works, but also about policies and policies at large. And I think that culture is coming in. Particularly for Swaniti and what our experience has been, we wanted to place, we had this program called Spark, and Spark was placing fellows, and we are about to restart it actually next month again. But Spark was placing fellows with members of parliaments in the constituency. And the thought there was that, a being with an elected official kind of exposes you to those gamut of things, and then you also get to know what the different pull forces are. So unlike in policy making, where you kind of have more structured kind of stakeholders, you have your beneficiary, you have your governmental stakeholders, you potentially have civil society. In government, you have a lot more pull forces. In politics, you have a lot more push and pull forces. So the point of the Spark program was to be able to expose that next generation of leadership. Now, what I think would be the next rung of jump is, if like the US or like other European democracies, we end up setting up staffers. A lot of staffers, a lot of American politicians already have staffers who work with senators or Congress people, and these are young graduates of fresh college graduates who essentially come in and who kind of get into that system of seeing how a senator or a congressman or a woman works, and being able to have that jump where we're able to institutionalize those systems of support, and there is hopefully the financial wherewithal to have young people come in and work. That I think is the next jump from an electoral and a political side, to bring in more young people.
Got it. And I have a very close friend who's also a Spark Fellow. He was a Spark Fellow in Bolangir. And he tells that is what initiated him onto the dream of actually wanting to join politics eventually. So I think vehicles like this bring people who do not have the risk appetite right away to join parties, but want to stay in this space and experiment it out. I think it becomes very important for initiating people into the longer haul journey. So that's something that Spark has definitely done, is what I would say.
Glad to hear.
The next one is actually on a very interesting insight that emerged when we were doing our ISD class of She Represents. And in one of our class, and so this was an entire cohort of women aspiring to be in politics, and all of us have already initiated some of the other developmental sector work. That was how the profile of the entire cohort was. So I think on the second or the third day, an interesting insight hit us that it's very easy to settle for less because we are doing good work already. So how do we really keep pushing our ambitions? How do you make maximizing public service and actually a very ambitious thing to do, and not settle just for the good work that we are going to do? And that's a story of a lot of people who I think have that eye on politics, are on the impact space, but then we're limiting ourselves thinking this is good enough already.
Yeah, so I think you have to kind of weigh out what your benefits or what your additions are of being in a political circuit versus being in development, because you are still in both cases optimally you want to improve the lives of people. The reason, well, one immediate reason which I can think someone comes into politics is because the scale of impact you're able to have. But for the scale of impact, the amount that you have to give up is also enormous, because when you're in public life there is of course a lot of pressures which is there. That's not just work pressures, there's work life balance, there is kind of more professional pressures. You're kind of battling n number of things, right? So then after a while I think a lot of people who do very good work in development are very comfortable, because they're like, we want to make people's lives better, we are doing it, why do I need to give up x number of things and then go into politics? So one big thing that, for example, I really value is privacy. Like, I don't want to have a living room where there are people constantly sitting there and just wanting to meet, and your house essentially becomes a public place. And at that, it's not just affecting you, it's also affecting your family. And so you're taking a call at this point in time that I want to kind of take the next jump, be okay with being that public figure, being okay with forgoing my privacy and my space and what I'm comfortable with. And I still want to go ahead and make that jump because impact is just that much more important. And so that's something which is what you have to figure out in your own mind. Now, if I were to take the example of, let's say, it's good, bad, or ugly, you can have your opinion of Donald Trump, but if you look at President Trump, essentially he was someone who loved being in public, right? He didn't care if it was whatever people were saying, good media, bad media, it didn't matter. But he was someone who was like, and you could see that, and he's one example. You see a lot of those examples in Indian politics, where you see people who are kind of attracted by being in the midst of people. If you look at the Chief Minister of Chhattisgarh, Bhupesh Baghel, when you see him, Baghelji, in like a public platform, you see he's like very comfortable with being around people. He's joking, he's kind of walking around. It's great. And so what you essentially start noticing and what you have to ask yourself is, one, do I want to kind of give up something to get to that point of impact? And two is kind of get out of your comfort spot. And two is, do I have the personality and kind of, does that excite me? Does being in between people excite me? A big part of being in politics is about listening to people and knowing perhaps you can't even solve their problems, but you have to be patient and listen and give them their time. And I was meeting with a chief minister like last week of Jharkhand, and one of the things that he did amazingly was, I was speaking to him and he kind of got the gist of what I had to say. And then, I was continuing and someone came in and he like paused that person and said, you finish what you need to say. I had nothing more to add to that conversation, but the fact that he was so willing to be like, no, you finish what you have to say is something which is so intrinsically political. It's much more different than the government sector. It's much more different than the private sector where you're efficient, you say what you have to, you're done, you move on. Like being a politician and understanding that whether or not you're comfortable getting out of your soft space is also asking, am I someone who can do that? And so, and a lot of people would say no, like I can't do that. I'm like, okay, you're done with the point, okay, let's move on. But you have to ask yourself those questions. Am I does listening to people make me comfortable? Is being in between 10,000 people something that makes me comfortable? I will have to go door to door and eat meals with a group of people, listen to them talk. A lot of them will not make sense, and yet I will continue to listen to them talk. Like those are little things which can be a pet peeve to people, but that is being a public leader. That is your ability to communicate, to understand, to empathize, which is so important, which is what I think is what you do at the in the impact sector is like 1x. What you do in the political sector of that is probably like 10 or 20x.
Got it. And this reminds me of the anecdote you've mentioned about Mrs. Indira Gandhi often caring about the point that she had to demonstrate it almost very visibly that she was listening to people more than anything else. And is that a gap that you see in the impact space, that we don't listen to people enough? We come with our own frameworks and our mindset of problem solving and fixing, but are not really listening to ground voices. Is that something that's plaguing the impact space generally?
Yeah, so see, in the impact space, there are two inherent limitations. And again, there are multiple limitations and multiple benefits. But amongst the limitations, I'd say one is that you become very sector specific. So the whole development sector is very like labor, education, governance. So your ability to kind of cut across sector is limited, because that's how essentially development sector has been formed. And so that makes it a little difficult for you to push your bandwidth across what happens, right? And now it has gotten narrower and narrower. So you're not just in education, you're in primary education. Not only are you in primary education, you're like in the first 1,000 days of education. So you kind of become very specific, which serves the purpose of being a space which is funded, but defeats the purpose of being able to get a holistic view of what is happening. And now that the impact space, again, and there are benefits to this, but the impact space now being data driven, right? You have to be able to reach 10,000 children, who have to then be able to have a ripple effect of 100,000 children, and subsequently in a year you're supposed to show 500,000 children who are better educated, right? So because your goals are tied, your sectors are tied, your ability to stretch yourself, if you want to be like a well-funded, well-renowned organization that is impact-driven, becomes limited through that space, right? So one of the things that we grapple with is we're in governance, but we work across multiple sectors. And so then after a while, we've kind of started facing pressure is, do we want to kind of focus on one sector? But if you realize in Indian bureaucracy or Indian political space, a politician or a bureaucrat isn't told कि आज आप अगले 10 साल के लिए infrastructure पे काम करो, right? Politician doesn't even know whether he or she will be in office for the next 10 years. Bureaucrat is very likely to get transferred. So your stakeholder with whom you're interacting with already has a cross-cutting approach. And your ability to now say, no, I will only focus on this, limits your ability. And I think that is one of the inherent issues which exists in the impact sector, is if you're looking to translate from the impact sector to going ahead and to working in the political sector, you have to have that approach, that cross-cutting approach of being able to address different things, being able to have an idea of what it is, and then also talking to people about it, right? You have to kind of ground it all in a very human approach. If there is someone who's coming from economically weaker sections, they're going to have 20 other problems, and education and health is one of them, but maybe law and order is a third one, maybe access to proper infrastructure, proper care is a fourth one. Like, it is a gamut, it is a much more holistic view, which I think we are right now in a little bit of a rut where we're asked to focus on one thing.
Got it. I think that brings me to my next question on sense of identity. You make a very interesting comparison in the book about ideology dominated politics of the West and identity dominated politics in India, to the point that it makes me think, given the diversity we constitute, probably identity and preservation of it matter so much more here. And that's why we've seen a lot of interesting identity-based political parties shifting spaces in the ecosystem here. So how can the youth whose interest in politics has been piqued by the beauty of democratic ideals, growth and development models, truly find our respective identities? Like where do we find identity in that sense? What is our community?
Yeah, so I think it's hard. I think that's a question which we're still grappling with. I think we don't have a solution to it right now in terms of being what. So, you know, I think I was mentioning this right now, right before we started the conversation. Is working on another book, and it's essentially about like women and politics, and essentially who were the women who came into politics at different time beings. And when I look at identity from that perspective, if you look at the Indian identity at large, the reason we kind of focus more on identity is because I think historically we've been able to really, you know, we've been kind of post 1947, a lot of new states have emerged and a lot of new identity. I mean, most recently Telangana emerged, right? Telangana and Andhra, and essentially the bifurcation of the state. And so in the last few years is when we really started to think what it means to be Indian, what is the national identity. And when I say few years, I mean a couple of decades. What does it mean to be Indian? Where are we driving this whole piece? And within that, for young people to identify who they are and what it means, right? So Lipsa, the first conversation you and I had was, oh, the Rashogolla is essentially now Odia and not Bengali, right? And so that is what is identity, right? It's we're kind of still morphing. We're still trying to figure out, okay, what does it mean to be a Bengali? What does it mean to be Odia? What does it mean to be a Marathi? And I think that's why essentially why we are kind of not, I would say our politics has evolved differently. Our politics has evolved into a place where we can't look at the West and say, oh, I'm for small government and big business, or I'm for small government and multiple businesses, and having a state versus center bifurcation, because guess what, those things were never important to us. And that is something which is important in the Indian context. Is it is important for us to know, instead it's important for us to know, okay, what state did we come from? Because for us, that thinking of our state, our community is the one who protects us. Whatever our ethnic background is what protects us. And that is something that is so deeply rooted that it almost makes sense for us not to emerge out of that, to embrace it, and to then figure out within this context what are the values that are important to us.
Got it. And I think that's a balance that young people interested in politics have to figure out, because we see to the point that identity as a word is sneered at also, right? Identity politics as a term is also sneered at. But what if that is what establishes your connect to the community? So then how do we balance that identity and then figure out the ideology within that boundary, as you just mentioned? So I hope we find ours.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at a lot of, like, again, Western thought and theorists, like I remember when I was an undergrad, and I went to a professor and he was like, the Eastern countries, the non-Western democracies are very, like, they focus it a lot on identity politics, right? And it was, you're right, it was sneered at, but it's not wise to sneer at that, because that is not how that communities evolved, right? And if you look at the elections that the US just had, what was that? That was also identity politics. There was a Midwest, like, essentially conservative belt, which was going ahead and recognizing that if I don't preserve the values of my community, then whoever the next president is might erode that. So I mean, I think ultimately it comes down to identity. You can kind of have it well packaged under the political ideology thought, or you could have identity which pushes your ideology and your values. So I know I'm a Bengali, and by virtue of that, being a Bengali, I might say, we've had for the very longest time liberal thought, entrenchment in literature, kind of these thoughts, and therefore my value is I value education by virtue of that. And that can be something which is an ideology which is kind of embedded in my identity as being a Bengali, right? I think again, the East, I would say similar things are Odisha, right? That Odisha is something which is like a hardworking culture where there's a lot of push for being entrepreneurial. So what you can say is, again, being a Odia, my value is entrepreneurship and taking initiative, and maybe that's what it is. And so identity, like, I think there was a lot of judgment in the West, and especially around the framing of identity in terms of identity politics, but the truth is that identity roots a lot of what values emerge.
Got it. Yeah. I think, and we'll all be in this journey of finding that balance of identity and then what we want to do within that. The next question I want to ask is on understanding of power and and how do we even want it for ourselves? Because there's a certain kind of empowerment and a sense of healing in just dissenting and demanding for our legal rights, constitutional rights, and making things happen that way, making change from the outside. So what does it mean then to realize the importance of being in power, needing that power, and therefore building a very positive relationship with the want of power? How do we do that transition from being that satyagrahi and the dissenter to actually really want power for ourselves? Because I think that's what's going to put us into the journey of wanting to become the politician.
Absolutely. And it's a really interesting question. Because I've been grappling with this thought for a very long time. We have a very funky relationship with power. Like, it's quite interesting. We don't appreciate, if you look at Indian history, it's quite fascinating. We don't always appreciate those who are in power because we assume power with a lot of negative connotations. But yet we seek to kind of use that power, we kind of seek to empower ourselves to remove those things from power, right? So I mean, it's not an incumbency piece. I think we look at anyone who's in office and be like, oh, they're in power, they can't be that good because they are in office. And essentially at the same time, like, there's a lot of conversation about, okay, how do you create that kind of quote anti-establishment thought of sorts? And I think the only way to do this is to accept the fact that, and have respect for larger institutions and that power component. And I think it's okay when you're in the 60s and 70s and essentially pushing back on government policies, but I think right now for young people particularly, there has to be a lot of respect for people in office and people kind of that office itself. You don't have to respect the MP, but you have to respect the parliament. You don't have to respect the prime minister, but you have to respect his office right now, right? So I think having that as a key part of not just our educational institutions, but also our conversations is just very important. Because if we don't do that, then that becomes a kind of, a difficult point to cross. So when I started out Swaniti, which is like now 10 years ago, I remember I used to be like, oh, we work with members of parliaments. And the first thing we'd hear is, why do you want to work with politicians? Like, what is wrong with you? Like, of all the stakeholders in the world, and I'd get back that pushback of like, why don't you, अगर काम करना ही था डेवलपमेंट में तो एनजीओ के हिसाब से करते, बहुत लोग हैं ग्रासरूट्स में क्यों नहीं करते? And so you kind of have to be like, listen, like, I get your point, I get, like, everyone has an opinion, and thank you for sharing yours, but the larger point is that if we don't improve those systems, if we don't support the institutions that are already in such places of influence, then you are going to have a systems issue. And so what you notice in India is that you're absolutely right. There is an entrenched disdain for what is being in office. And I think that's changing. And I think, all of these fellowship programs, all of these institutions, these are opening up. We're also a country that loves giving the UPSC exam. Like, this is our shindig. Like, the number of people who I have met who have given the UPSC exam for multiple years attest to the fact that we really do have some level of aspiration with government offices, but yet as soon as it translates to electoral office, we're like, wo kyu karna hai? Like, क्यों election में खड़ा होना है, क्यों contest करना है, पता है क्या होगा? And so I think the first thing first is the conversations which we are having has to change. I think the media projection of how, I think we confuse the office with the person. So when we say this politician has misbehaved, we're now saying it's not just him or her, it's also their office and what the institution at large stands for. And that has become gravely problematic. So one of the things, good, bad, or ugly, I really appreciate about this, the current kind of last few years of Prime Minister Modi's conversation has been that he has been like, I am the Prime Minister and there has to be a certain amount of respect for my office. Mm-hmm. And you see that in the West. You see that, at least before Trump, you had a lot of people who respected, whether they liked Obama or not was a different story. They respected the the president's office. Same thing with George Bush. They respected the Bush's office. So that inherent, that difference between the office and the individual needs to be there. And as young people, as old people, whatever it is, we need to say, yes, this politician was wrong, but his or her office is still a place of respect and reverence, and we cannot cross that line.
Got it. That's a very beautiful insight that if I had to develop a very positive relationship or understanding of power, the starting point is respecting office. And that's where we start from accepting that being in power is good, and therefore you could want it for ourselves too. Wow, that's interesting. As I was reading through and understanding the inner workings of political parties in the book and their hierarchical organizational structures that we have. We have something called the party high command and the small group of leaders who actually make all the decisions. I'm wondering about how democratic processes are practiced within parties. And therefore, can we really practice something externally if it's not emulated within our organizations? And what does it mean for young people when they make a choice of which political party to join?
See, I think I might have written this in the book. I don't remember, but I might have written like it's a big black hole. Like once you get into a party structure, like you're like, what the heck is going on, right? And I think to a great extent that's still true. As someone who speaks to some political leader almost every day, it's always been fascinating to me. Is I feel like I get so many different versions of what's going on within a political party, and I think what you have to kind of realize, and there's kind of the quick way of doing it and then the more kind of longer thought pensive way, and it depends on who you are as a person to figure out what you want to do. The quick way is kind of talking and figuring out who can be your mentors, and from that you can get a sense of perhaps what the larger party is, and is there someone who's really kind of you is able to handhold you and teach you. And I think that is just super important to be able to figure out how the party structure works. The second is kind of really understanding and examining the roots of a political party. So again, I was kind of reading this biography of this one of the women representatives in Congress, and she was Sarla Devi, and in one of her autobiographies she writes like, I'm very frustrated with the Congress because the Congress is always kind of laid back, they don't take to the streets, they're not that aggressive, why are they not beating people up, like what is this conversation in Congress? And I was thinking to myself, well, that's been true of Congress for as long as I've been alive. I guess, it was true even before I was born, because this lady wrote in like 1870 something, this kind of critique of Indian National Congress. And I was thinking to myself, I guess there are some cultural pieces which stay true of different political parties, regardless of how long they've been around. And I think what it essentially attests is that the longer way is to kind of get into the roots of what political parties mean, right? So BJP, right, the founding kind of pieces of BJP is, essentially their founder being upset with Nehru, and at that point in time saying we need to go ahead and not be just catering to a lot of refugees. And I think he wrote that the founder's name escapes me right now, but essentially I remember that narrative where he'd written that he was the minister of industries, if I'm not wrong, and he had been sent to Bengal to be able to understand how many refugees had come into Bengal, and to essentially set up refugee camps in Bengal. And what he had noticed at that point in time was that in Bengal, a lot of the Muslim dominated refugee camps had more resources than the Hindu dominated refugee camps. And so he had come back to meet Nehru in Kashmir, where he noticed the same thing, and to tell him that, look, you can't have a bias on who gets what support on religious lines. And when Nehru kind of dodged his meetings a few times, and then when he met him, he didn't give him a satisfactory answer and said, we need to help the weak, we need to help the more vulnerable, and kind of edges him aside. That's when he was like, we need to create an alternative to Congress, where we need to have that thinking of, okay, what else can we do, where we are being equally treating all people as opposed to certain groups of people. And so when you read that history, and this is kind of the longer version of how do you figure out what party, is when you start seeing what the roots of that party are, that's when you can figure out, okay, is this something that really resonates with me, really echoes with me? And that's kind of the more pensive and thoughtful way of doing this. The other way is, like I said, you can find out what a mentor, a supporter who can really help you in the process. And from that kind of more trial and error process, and see if that resonates with you or not. And then I think, external to political parties are fairly isolated. It's hard to do that. You can't, I think, unless and until you decide to just kind of start your own, which given the ecosystem is I would actually say is not a bad idea, but it's hard to operate within a political party system without really getting into it.
Got it. And so and the name I think that you were trying to mention was Shama Prasad Mukherjee.
Shama Prasad Mukherjee, thank you.
Feel so proud of having remembered it from the book.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. So Shama Prasad Mukherjee is the one who went and he was like Bengali, and he's like, Bengal is mostly Hindu, like why you? And he kind of had this like long, I think he wrote like some 12 or 13 letters to Nehru, saying why is it that you're doing that? And Nehru kind of didn't respond. And then I remember Shama Prasad Mukherjee was like, I'll go to Kashmir, and he went to Kashmir and he went to refugee camps, and he's like, crap, same thing is happening here. So it was interesting that Shyam Prasad Mukherjee, if that is the roots of Shyam Prasad Mukherjee, then the question becomes, okay, does this resonate with me? The fact that everyone needs to be treated equally, there can't be any Muslim, Hindu, Christian, Jain, whatever bifurcation, does that resonate with me most strongly?
Got it, got it. And what I also wanted to understand or discuss a little bit more is how does what happens, the processes that we have when we have to grow inside the party, and the entire nexus kind of a mechanism that's there versus a very like straightforward open mechanism of growing. How does that translate into the way then we behave outside, or the way politicians behave outside? Does that influence the kind of choices that they make outside, or following of democratic processes that they make outside? How does that behavior actually translate out from the party that I'm a part of?
Yeah, so it depends on the party. So, again, there have been, so I think the initial pieces of it are fairly kind of straightforward. Is, if Sorisa goes to election, Lipsa says, I really want to go ahead and contest in another 5 years. I want to now make a very strong presence in Odisha. So, one of the most straightforward ways is to actually participate in the election process, is to say, look, I am very good at hypothetically social media, and I will go ahead and join party X, and I will go ahead and make sure that there's things trending every day. I will make sure that videos are being made and they are going through WhatsApp, and you kind of choose and pick what your strengths are and then align that to the party. That is how you kind of grow. And in my experience, what I've noticed a lot is people come to the attention of senior party leaders is when you're able to create value in election, because clearly, democratic process election is going to be a litmus test. So I think being able to do that makes initially perfect sense. Then I think kind of external to the party, it depends party to party. A lot of people want you to be, Lipsa goes to TV and she's amazingly articulate and she's able to kill every debate. So now the party says, Lipsa, you're going to go ahead and have to have this persona and speak on party lines every single time. At that point, you need to carry that persona forward. A lot of parties don't expect you to do that. They won't expect you to go speak against the party lines, but they won't be like, okay, I want you to go out and set up a dharna and sit outside the chief minister or ex-chief minister's office or anything of that sort. So it is really like a variable piece in terms of not just who you decide to join, but then also what role you decide to take on. Especially now, there are quite a few roles which are in the backdrop, where they have elected officials who are the brains of the party, who are much better at kind of doing the research, the data analytics, figuring out what's going on in the back end. And so these people are never expected to go and have a personality or kind of take forward what they're doing outside the electoral piece. But it really just depends.
Got it. Got it. The next question, or the next piece that I want to discuss with you, is on something that almost every speaker, practitioner who came and spoke as she represents at ISD, the first thing they told is, if you are women who want to start in politics, please figure your finances out, because that's going to be very important. And your book also has an entire dedication of what does finance even mean in the entire, or where do you have to be spending, where do you, like, how do you earn, what does finances mean in the political context. So in that context, I want to just understand, how do we see this relationship with money versus the entire Gandhian life of leadership that we have as a benchmark in this country, right? You have to be this ascetic who gives up, and that's the image of you as a social leader, or as a public leader. How do we balance that both, the real need for money and this, and therefore the relationship with money that we should be having?
Yeah, so again, full disclosure. So Lipsa, I think this is true. I'm glad that you had that in your program where women leaders came out, but I think it's true of everyone across the spectrum. Like man, woman, doesn't matter who you are, you have to figure out your finances. And I think again, our relationship with power is as funky as our relationship with money. I don't know what the deal is. I really try to trace back to Indian history and figure out why is it that we are not fiercely capitalist, but we are not fiercely socialist either. So what exactly are we? And so, I think that relationship with money is something which, full disclosure, I'm not a huge fan of like give up everything for public service, because I don't think that's sustainable. I think that shrinks the pool of the number of people who want to come in. And I think your decisions are then driven by passion and not by logic. So your decision to come in and join politics is going to be passionate, and you'll be like, I want to do this. And then it's not just you, you're choosing your family. If you want to have a family, perhaps you don't want to have a family, but then you're affecting your parents, you're affecting essentially all relationships, which to me is just, it's a weird dynamic. Like, I don't know why one would do that. But for, again, as you might know, I also grew up in the US, which was like a very capitalist society. So I'm always perplexed. I'm like, why wouldn't you do that? So I think for me, the big piece is that given where we are going, given that there's an opportunity, a window of opportunity to bring in young people, to bring in very talented young people like yourself to politics, there needs to be a set way in which you're able to compensate adequately what you are doing, the electoral career, right? Either you do that, or you have people who give part of their time to politics, but then it becomes a hobby and not a profession. And if it becomes a hobby and not a profession, then your quality will struggle, then the ability to serve people will struggle, and then one can't fault political leadership for not being adequate, because the system is set as such that it does not allow for talent to dedicate their entire time. So the easiest way of doing this is for political parties to create corpuses, which I think in the book I mentioned, BJP RSS does have some sort of a corpus to do that, but it needs to be more kind of widespread. It needs to be across parties who want to have a future. It can also very well be the case that, again, much like Western democracies, you create the job positions, the job opportunities. You don't just, ask your social media person to volunteer their time. You actually pay for that person to be there, right? And you actually spend that money out, right? And so then what ends up happening is you are able to get the best talent, because it's not just about people who are passionate, but people who are okay, are comfortable with the fact that I can go ahead and maybe make a quarter, a half, three-fourths of my salary, but yet not, like, basically not live up to my savings without any future. So you're able to kind of attract that talent into the political system. And I think that in an optimal case should be long term within parties who realize that it's important from them to bring in newer talent. The problem is twofold. One is that there is a certain amount of inertia and comfort of people in political system who don't want new talent to come in, right? And that is one of the basic issues which is at the root of this is, what if this person takes my position? What if they're more qualified, right? And that is again a fundamental issue which has come in, is that because politics is still, so much of it is about social capital and social network, which is easily transferable. It's hard to like kind of maintain your position. So the best way to do is just be a gatekeeper and not allow for new talent to come in, or allow limited trickle of talent who you can control. The second thing is also, I think our campaign finance systems, our political party functioning systems are very flawed. If you go into the depths of it, you'll start realizing for a party to have someone on their payroll, now the opposition can start investigating. Now that can create like a whole number of issues. What happens? How do you allocate resources? And the problem then becomes is that we haven't created the systems to allow for this to happen. The result is that corruption is mass in politics. That is the result. Is if I'm not able to earn, and I've invested 10 years of my life and I'm finally in office, I'm going to make up for that 10 years. Right? And unless I'm passion driven and I'm just like, this is the right thing for me to do, there's a good chance that there's going to be a good number of people who are going to, try and take advantage of that office. And we see that quite a bit. I mean, this is not a surprise. So it's not just for, it's not just in for nation building that you have to do this, for to like, curtail down corruption. But if you are sitting at the helm of a political party and you want to make sure that you have the best talent that comes in and this party succeeds and survives and thrives, there needs to be a system which is very similar to like a private sector system, where you're saying, I'm going to get good talent. I don't need to pay like a McKinsey pays. I can go ahead and pay a little bit less, but I need to pay.
Got it. And our next question is a very interesting, and it's going to be interestingly linked to what you mentioned about talent entry and gatekeeping. It's from Ankur Chowri. He's one of our Facebook viewers. So do you think there needs to be a structural and well-designed framework for filtering the kind of people who enter the political ecosystem, like some sort of an assessment body by an independent body to judge public service and decision-making intent?
See, in a democratic system, it'd be hard to say that for a party worker or to join a party to create the system. But there exists some level of that filtering when people get tickets for office, right? So let's take the example of of Congress in Bengal. When someone gets nominated for a position, a seat, and this happens actually in most places, not just Congress, but also general election for BJP. But what happens is you'll have a state, you'll have like a district president who can potentially nominate someone. They typically can do a due diligence on that person at a state level, including like profile, court cases, all of these things, and then it goes to the national kind of headquarters for approval, right? And so you have those three layers which technically are there. The problem is that neither you nor I know whether there's like a standard metric sheet, right? So I know that there's betting happening and one person got selected over another, but it doesn't tell me like, a proper scoring sheet which is like, okay, background of person, educational qualification 10 points, ability to mobilize group 20 points. Like what is the metric of that? And that is where it gets nebulous, is there's like some macro structure, but then it ends up being that I get along with the state president and he or she likes me better, and therefore I got nominated and the other guy got booted out. So I think what we need to do is, I think filters exist. The transparency of at least what a filter looks like, at least within the party system, needs to exist as well.
Got it. Thank you for answering that we'll have to live with the nebular nature of it. The next question is from Deepak Negi. What was Swaniti Initiative's experience while working with parliamentarians? Any specific top of mind insight or experience you would want to share with us?
So I thought it was really, so for me personally, and I'd let my colleagues answer for them, but I personally thought it was a very enriching experience. I mean, even today, you kind of can see that, like, if I kind of bifurcate between elected representatives and non-elected representatives, government officers, and the way that they approach problem solving, the way that they look at ground and community is very different. And it's the little things, like you learn, I think, to a great extent, how to be better at dealing with public. So one thing that and I tell this to Anurag Thakur as well, one thing he taught me was, he was one of the first MPs we worked with. And whenever I'd go to see him, he would walk me out to the car, right? And these are small civilities which are completely surprising to me, and I have to learn. But those are things which I've learned, is when someone leaves, you walk them out. When someone comes in, you offer them tea. Like, I am terrible. Like I said, I grew up in the US. So we used to, like, if someone knocked on the door, you open the door and you were like, yes, what do you need? And that was that, right? And there was no walking to the car, there was no offering tea. You don't know who these people are. So what you kind of realize is that there is a lot to learn from them in terms of public interface. There's a lot to learn in terms of how to solve problems. And I think politicians are very good at firefighting. They're very good at thinking on their feet. They're very good at figuring out what the solution is. If there is no solution, how do you kind of veer off the road? So the ability, I think, the first set of stakeholders we worked with was parliamentarians, and then eventually we started working with state governments. But I think that experience was very enriching in being able to understand kind of the macro context within which governance operates.
Got it. And that's why I think vehicles like that are becoming even more popular for young people to enter and see that interface with constituency and politics. The next question is from Anurag Dash, and he asks, how can young people getting into politics earn a fair living without leveraging their political connections? And I would just want to append it to, why should we not leverage whatever resources that you have?
So I think it's hard. So I think, in the book, I think I try to list out a few opportunities where you can be consultants, you can kind of work part-time. I think I would kind of stick to that, is, you see, there's strategic ways in which you can work, and in order to understand how politics works, right? In order to build your social capital in politics, you don't need to leave everything and just do that. You don't need to just go and run around a person and be able to just build that social capital around multiple people. You can kind of space that out. Where I think you can really kind of look at opportunities, where I'd say, is possibly dip into your savings, possibly look at consulting, possibly look at other opportunities, is when elections come around. And I think that is where your full-time attention and your full-time mind space is needed. Before that, essentially, you feel like you're just kind of interviewing for different rounds and different roles and opportunities. You are trying to explore where within, like, again, if I can take the very crude analogy of the World Bank, you're applying to work at the World Bank. Invest like a year in understanding, do I want to work on the poverty reduction unit? Do I want to work in the country office? Do I want to work on somewhere else, right? Then and you talk to different people, and you meet with different people, and you network and you grow. As elections come in, this is when you have to actually apply for the position and do what you need to. So this is where you're like, okay, let me pull myself out of where I am, take like a month. And the funny and interesting thing about India is like, elections really get intense in the last month and a half. So unlike the US, you don't have to invest a year long. So that's when I'd probably say, okay, this is when you need to figure out, can I take a month and a half leave and go work on a campaign? And that is all I will do. And so the only way to kind of protect your finances is without completely giving up on it, and by allocating only a certain amount of time. And I think it just keeps things clear. I always feel like when you work for a party with the intent of only working for the party without leveraging anything from them, your chances at building that trust and being able to be pulled into what they're doing is much quicker and much more. Because the party is like, you don't want anything from me, this is great, I would definitely love to use you, like. And so your trust, your ability to kind of really tap into inner networks just grows exponentially, as opposed to, well, she's doing this for me, but then I know she's going to ask me something back. And so then you kind of keep your distance and you measure how much you're going to ask the person, because you know this is transactional.
That's a very interesting tactical point to keep in mind. The next one is from Pranay Manjari, and I think this correlates to what we have spoken on identity as well as money and the relationship with that. She's asking, is there any opportunity for a new political party based on gender identity in the current political space to survive and thrive in India?
Oh my God, I would be so happy, Manjari. Like, this would make me, like, tears would flow down my eyes. I would totally. And I say this because we've tried to do research and actually understand how gender identity has evolved. The problem with gender identity and having a party along gender lines is the identity continues to be very abstract. There is not one unified want, desire, demand from women at large, right? So you would, even when it comes to law and order, even if you go, and we did this research in Haryana, even if you go to Haryana and where you'd be like, oh, law and order is nonsensical, women need to be protected, blah, blah, and you come in with your preconceived notions, and you will notice, like, when we went in, we were like 33% of women wanted better jobs, 20% of them wanted better roads, which makes, I'm just like, well, and then you realize that they want better roads is because they want to access the next neighborhood or access the next place that they want to go to. And I think it was like 10 or 12% who thought law and order was important. And so the issue with gender, as I've seen it, is that I think the tides are shifting quickly. So it would be silly of me to say that there is no scope. But a few years ago, when we did research, I think the kind of silver lightning would be, it's the silver lining, or the silver bullet would be, if you're able to figure out what that unifying factor of gender looks like, which can allow for that campaign, that party to thrive. Aam Aadmi Party did it brilliantly back when they started out. They were able to figure out the silver bullet was corruption. And let's just hit it on the head repeatedly, because this is something which is cross-cutting. What is that one issue which will resonate with women?
Got it. That's a very interesting insight to find that basic common minimum basis which we could appeal to that constituency as a block in itself. The next question is from Shrutika Silswal, and she asks, as a youth, what is the mindset one requires to step into politics and stick and sustain in that career, given the kind of stimulus that's around? What keeps you going, or what can keep you going?
So I think everything is caveated by, you need patience. You need patience, and you need quite a bit of luck, actually. But I think luck is cross-cutting. I think you need luck in whatever you do. I don't think it's more in politics versus less in business. I think but you need quite a bit of patience. You need quite a bit of perseverance, and I think you need to have your goal very clearly, right? So one of my really good examples, like, I've really enjoyed speaking a lot to Tejasvi, who's one of the youngest MPs in parliament, and he's a great guy. But I think he's one of the anomalies who at the age of, I think, 26 or 27 came into parliament. And so, not everyone can be a Tejasvi, but a lot of people who are looking on to him will be like, I totally want to be him. Like, if he can do it, why can't I? Right. And the thing is, there's a lot of right place, right time. And again, this is not to downplay that he's brilliant and he's hardworking and he's amazing, but it is to say that, speaking to him and speaking to other young political leaders, you kind of have very clearly in your mind what to do. So with him, one of the things that he did, and he talks about it quite a bit, I'm sure you'll notice it in his other interviews, he's like, I started working for the party when I was 16, right? So people come and see the 26-year-old me, but they don't see the 16-year-old me who was running around, and I couldn't even vote, and I was still like, I'm going to work for this party, right? And so I think having that clarity, And again, he's an anomaly, but having that clarity, having that vision, knowing where you want to do, what you want to do is just really important. And then knowing that this is a patience game. We are not, what is it, Finland, where the prime minister is like a 28-year-old young lady. I met her and she visibly looks younger than me, which is very, disconcerting after a while. But I feel like those are the things that you need to keep in mind, is that our country context does not allow for you to necessarily grow in your 20s, but something in your 30s or maybe in your 40s. But again, there are enough examples which you can follow.
Got it. And the next question is from Ulas Vairakar, and this is something that we've discussed already today around identity and ideology. He asks, is identity less an ideological politics resulting in communist parties becoming a lesser of a force in India? What has changed in the last 25 years? They were a strong force 25 years back, but where is that balance between identity and ideology out there?
So you're right. I think communists have kind of gone out. But it's interesting. So if you read a lot of literature now, which is coming out, it's arguing for the fact that the left of center will actually make a comeback. And the argument is that what you see in the last 5-10 years has been a lot of what the ideology of the left was driven by populism. It was a lot of also kind of strong social nets. And if you look at the right and the center of right parties, a lot of that has already been captured by them. And one of the reasons that people are not necessarily leaning is because, you see, you have to understand that in Bengal and Kerala, which continue to still have some presence of the left, I think Kerala more so than Bengal, uh, the base of the pyramid, the voter, which who's like the right towards like the middle income or the lower income bracket, did not necessarily vote for CPM because they thought Marx was a rock star and was like, I have read Marx and this is amazing. They voted for him or voted for the party because there was that very strong component of welfare state and that very strong component of populism. When you have in Bengal free water, which again just like boggles my mind, is how can you give water for free in any case? But when you have free water, you essentially captured that demand of the voter, and you don't need to be a CPIM. A voter doesn't care if you're from Marx or a Marxist or not. A voter cares whether I'll get free water or not. So that space of what the voter wants has already been captured by a lot of the other parties. So then the question becomes, if you're a CPIM, then what is your value proposition? And so that is what I think is kind of re-emerging, is that I think there's a lot of social policies, which is where the space essentially still exists for the left of center, which is where they're capturing that kind of social norms of what does it mean to marry whoever you want, regardless of religion and regardless of being afraid that you're going to be sent to prison for that. And I think that's the space which is now being increasingly coming into being.
Got it. So that transition from simple entitlements that you give to the voter versus complex ones where a lot more navigation has to be done around, it cannot be as simple as giving free water or free electricity for that matter.
Yeah.
Got it. The last question is from Pallavi, and she asks, what can political parties do to attract principled politicians? The answer seems straightforward, lower the barriers. But what is that one thing that they could start with?
Principled politician is always a tricky thing. I don't think there are enough principled business people to get principled politicians, right? And there the transactions are fairly straightforward. So I feel, what political parties, it's a very complicated question, because the implication there is that the existing cohort is not principled, which I think it's a mixed bag, honestly. I don't think there is, you can kind of say there's certain cohorts who are not principled and who are principled. So my first contention would be, I don't think it'd be fair to imply that politicians for the majority are not principled. And my second contention would there be, I can't think of any field. Development field. Not everyone is principled, right? Like there is a whole debate which happens in terms of, should we really push for better healthcare in certain communities, and what does it mean? Like there are always so many issues and nuances that exist. I think the first thing we need to do is define principled politician. And Lipsa, you and I talked about the need to pay more, the need to actually have more ways to attract more. We have to and be okay with the concept of power. So if we can say a principled politician is someone who we're okay being high paying, very powerful, and is someone who will take the best decision for people, then we can go ahead and figure out what the barriers are, right? So I think the first thing that we need to do to have those conversations on what principled politician is, have a standardized definition of what principled means. And again, if you were to ask me, I would totally be like, it needs to be a high paying person who's totally comfortable with power, probably ends up getting bonuses if he or she does well, and then be able to then attract talent. I know this is my definition. Now let's go ahead and attract talent from that perspective.
Got it. I think when you ask the question, what does principle mean, that brings us home to Indian School of Democracy. And since I'm an alum, I'll take the leeway of doing some publicity. So if we want to understand what makes a politician, we pick up Rwitwika's book. And if we want to become a principled politician, we apply for the Good Politician program that ISD is running. And our applications are open till 31st of December. And this has been an amazing conversation, Rwitwika, very insightful and incisive across power, money, and intent and even ambition around politics.
I'm glad. Thank you so much for having me.
And before you leave us, I think there's one quote that I want to leave everyone with that was at the end of your book. So 2 things happen under extreme pressure: matter is crushed and diamonds are formed.
Thank you so much for having me, Lips. I really appreciate it. It's been such a pleasure being here, and I'm really excited about seeing the next cohort of public leaders.
Thank you, both of you. Couldn't have, I think this is one of the finest conversations we've had on Democracy Samvaad. So I'm very, very happy. For our viewers, I've linked Rwitwika's book. We really, really recommend it. So do try and catch it. And thank you so much, Lipsa, also for being such a wonderful moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Meenakshi.